So thank you for coming. My name is Edil Sepulveda, and this is the November Policy Speaker Series from NASA's Carbon Research Program. I would like to welcome today's speakers, Kevin Brown. He's a senior geospatial analyst, and Gabriel Sidman. He's a geospatial analyst for Windrock International. They're going to be presenting on putting data to work. They're going to present some of the challenges and practical approaches to bring remotely sensed data into land use planning in the developing world. They are going to be introducing some web-based tools that they have developed for Cambodia and for Indonesia, and these web tools seek to address some of the challenges that they're going to be presenting. We're going to have a questions and answers discussion panel at the end of the presentation. So please let the questions for the end. And without further ado, I'm going to leave you with Kevin.
Great, thank you for the introduction and thank you for having us today. We're here today from Windrock International, which we'll give a brief word on shortly. I'm Kevin Brown. My background is with remote sensing science, but I've been working in the development sphere and the environment for the past 5 years.
And I'm Gabriel Sidman. I also have a background in GIS and spatial analysis. I've been at Windrock for about 3.5 years now. So I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks, Elil, for the introduction, and thank you all for having us here. What we are hoping to talk about today are some of the challenges and approaches that we've developed for bringing some remotely sensed data, spatial data, to and applying it in the developing world. So the presentation today, this is what we'll cover. So we'll just briefly introduce you to Windrock International. We'll go over what we do. Kevin and I are both in what we call the Ecosystem Services Unit, so we'll tell you specifically what we do there. And then we'll go into some of the challenges we've encountered in the work that we do, dealing with spatial data. And we'll go over some case studies, specifically Cambodia, Malawi, and Ghana. Sorry, we had Indonesia in there before, but we swapped out and put in Malawi. And then we'll talk about some of our some global tools that we've developed as well. And then we'll finish up. So Windrock International is a nonprofit. We are headquartered, we have an office here in Crystal City, just across the metro area, but Windrock actually has its headquarters in Arkansas because it was actually, it was started there, actually part of the Rockefeller family. Winthrop Rockefeller is what the name comes from. And we are a nonprofit, an NGO, and we focus on our mission, which has to do with empowering the disadvantaged, increasing economic opportunity, and sustaining natural resources all across the globe. So we're quite diverse in that sense. So you might hear of Windrock, you might first know Kevin and I and think, oh, Windrock is a bunch of GIS guys, but actually, we're 2 of the 3 in the organization, and then there's a wide range of people who work on agriculture, work on business opportunity, work on all sorts of different things, natural resource management, clean energy, leadership development, and we work all over the world. Often we have project offices that's set up for 5 years or so to implement a USAID project in different countries. We do have permanent offices in Nairobi and Manila, as well as our offices in the States. So that's Winrock in general. And then we have our eco team that Kevin and I are a part of. And we function quite like a think tank in the sense that we are very focused on science-based approach, looking at quantification of ecosystem services. We deal a lot with tropical forestry, quantifying carbon emissions, other types of ecosystem services, water quality, water flood reduction, all these different aspects. We deal with pay for performance, PES schemes. We deal a lot with interactive tool development. So again, that's kind of the theme of today, is bringing some of the science down to a user level. That's what our tool development is focused on. We also deal with commodity chains and quantifying the impact of commodities on ecosystem services. So that's kind of a broad overview of our work. And so, whereas a lot of Winrock is mostly focused on project management, we delve a little bit deeper into some of the science and quantification approaches. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin now.
All right, thanks, Gabe. So kind of the theme of this talk is I'd like you to sort of see our group as, we're the people who kind of have the experience of bridging a lot of the products that come out of NASA to really their actual application on the ground in some pretty challenging conditions worldwide, both in terms of the environmental challenges as well as just the institutional challenges of working with some of these governments. And I think we can all appreciate that we're going through a renaissance in the availability of global remote sensing products in terms of just their volume, quality, accessibility. But what we've consistently run into in some of the countries that we work on and that we'll highlight today is that countries simply lack the resources. Sometimes it's the know-how. Sometimes it's just having enough time to keep up to date with new products that are coming out, understand how to integrate them with the actual obligations of their programming, whatever goals that they're required to meet in their department or ministry. And doing it in such a way that is consistent and repeatable over time, and that actually really helps them to do their own job. So this is a challenge that we've encountered in a diversity of countries. So I just included a couple slides just to kind of revel in the amazing data that's coming out these days. We have now the Sentinel-2 launched, which is comparable with Landsat 8. So we're having better and better medium resolution coverage of Earth systems, of Earth surface systems. There's a slew of new spaceborne radar missions that have gone up recently or being planned. So this is exciting for us. And I pulled a couple names of some other missions that we're kind of eagerly awaiting or trying to think about how to bring to our end users. Some of these are NASA, some are ESA. Advance itself. Okay. So yeah, we're eagerly awaiting FireSat. We're looking at this global precipitation measurement, some of the new spaceborne LiDAR missions that are getting developed, the EcoStress mission, and just the whole world of ultra-high resolution commercial imagery that's continues to proliferate. So, from kind of the remote sensing nerd side, we're really feel like we're in a golden age. So just getting back to some of the issues that we've faced, in developing countries. And I should maybe just preference that developing country is kind of a huge hodgepodge term that really encompasses like a whole range of economies and sizes and skill sets. So take that term with a grain of salt. Sometimes we're dealing with a subnational government in a larger, higher capacity country like Indonesia or Brazil, where maybe at the national level there's quite high capacity, but that hasn't really gotten down to the more provincial or district scale. So I hope you can forgive my kind of gross generalization of that term, but across these countries, sometimes it's just having access to technology, having a stable server. A lot of times it's that there may have been really high quality initiatives that were done in the country to study particular things, but that they came through donor-funded initiatives, and there hasn't been great continuity from one project to the next. So oftentimes the host country is sort of left not really understanding how they're supposed to use these products. Something we see a lot of times is the talent is, there may be great remote sensing or GIS talent, but that they're good, so they become in high demand and they get pulled into many different government initiatives. So those are just some of the generalized challenges that we face. And countries have oftentimes sort of different needs for remote sensing, for natural resource management or land use planning. And we can think of one as being sort of like a focused assessment where this may be a one-off analysis that's done to a very high degree of rigor and quality, kind of a state of the landscape. What are the opportunities for reduction in fuel wood over exploitation in the country over some period of time? So those are great, and that's a lot of where the history of donor-funded research has been in a lot of these countries. But there's the need just the need that we have perceived is that as soon as those reports hit the table, they're already out of date. So we've been trying to think of ways to help some of these governments really act on remote sensing data as it's being produced. So that can be for maybe a country or a government or a subnational jurisdiction has some kind of performance standard that they're trying to meet and that they need to monitor their performance towards. So that could be related to greenhouse gas emissions. It could be related to land use, percent tree cover. So looking at these sort of ongoing monitoring needs, kind of focusing within that, the real paramount criteria to make that work and to be sustainable within that country are you need repeatability and time series consistency for the data. And this is why everyone knows that Landsat has been such a massive global success, is because it's the length of the time series, and it's the fact that there's so much effort has gone in to make that to be a consistent time series, even across different iterations of the mission. And there needs to be a way to help countries understand how to actually turn that raw data, or whatever intermediary version that's coming out, as if it's some derived product, like some 16-day composite NDVI kind of thing, how to actually translate that into their policy needs. And also for countries having the confidence that these are actually, the approaches that they're using are accepted by the international scientific community. So those would be kind of the qualities that I would highlight would be the repeatability, the fact that it's been communicated in such a way that it's clear how it actually relates to their policy needs, and then that there are approved or that there are best practices for how to use that within the scientific community. So I would sort of position, I've kind of created this, if you can think of sort of a spectrum of remote sensing data, where on the one side you have the very technical scientific side of the engineering side of it, really creating a high quality product, all the way to the other side, which is a sort of local knowledge about the local ecosystem, the local policy objectives, even how, how does the particular institution that needs to act on that data operate? They need to have updates every 2 years because that's what the law is in that country or that province. That's a kind of like a local knowledge. And there's such a large spread there that it's not really possible to expect that anybody can cover this entire spectrum. It wouldn't be expected of anybody. So where we've tried to position ourselves in our ecosystem team at Winrock is what we often do is, although we have a background in the technical knowledge to understand some of the technical details of how these products are being produced, we often kind of start in the intermediary, what I would call like the derived product area, where there's some expectation that some data product is going to be created at regular intervals by NASA or by some other group. And then we sort of figure out how to take those, apply international scientific best practices to turning those into, answering some kind of question, whether it's carbon related, whether it's related to hydrologic systems, and then developing approaches for that country to actually act on that data. So, and I have here on that, covering this space here from bridging the technical to local, I have Winrock International, but I think that I would put in like the entire international development community in there as well. Just groups that have a long-term presence of being engaged on the ground in these countries. Okay. So without further ado, I will we'll get into some of the actual good stuff of the presentation. We'll talk about some of our countries we've worked in, and Gabriel?
Great. Tag team presentation here.
Yep.
Okay, so we're going to start with our case studies with Cambodia. We've been working there for about 4 or 5 years, as just specifically with a USAID funded project supporting forests and biodiversity. So through that project, a lot of this work has been done. So the situation in Cambodia, when we got to understand it, we saw was a lot of use of these natural resources. So high utilization for basic subsistence. So the forests are heavily used. Fishing is such a huge industry there. Agriculture, especially rice production, is huge. So use of the land was very important, and due to several factors, especially not a ton of planning about how that land was used. We see that Cambodia has one of the highest rates of deforestation in the world, a lot of land degradation, and that causes lower resilience for these populations. Obviously, they need to use the land to make a living, to eat the food, to sell the rice that they produce. But over time, overutilization of that can lead to a lack of sustainability and other issues, degradation of the ecosystem services there. So we thought that what really they need here is a way to utilize all this wonderful data that Kevin was mentioning and really understand it and apply it to their land use planning process. So, how do they do that? How can we help bring some of this data to the regional government level, to the people that are really making the decisions about how the land is used and may not totally understand how to use all this spatial data that exists. So what we came up with is this, what we call the WEST tool, the Watershed Ecosystem Service tool, which is designed to harness all this data, spatial data from many different sources, ground data that has been collected in Cambodia, and present it on a unified platform on the web that can be accessed and queried and used by people who have no knowledge of GIS. They don't need to have a Esri license. They don't need to know how QGIS works. And they can get in there and take a look at how development has affected ecosystem services. They can query spatial data like the University of Maryland forest loss data set. There are topography layers on there. There's MODIS hotspot data. There's other layers that we've derived from some of the more primary data sets that are produced. And they can say, this is my area of interest. What has happened in the past? How has this area changed over the last 15 to 20 years? We have some climate change data in there, so they can say, well, okay, this is what's been happening. What could happen in the future if some of the projections from downscaled global circulation models come to pass? And we also used hydrological modeling using the soil and water assessment tool, which uses a lot of spatial data as an input, such as land cover, soils, topography, and we ran it over the Mekong watershed, which is the major watershed in Cambodia and includes the Tonle Sap lake. And we said, what happens with the if we put in the historical precipitation data? What will happen if we change that precipitation data a little bit based on global circulation models? How do different land covers react? Where are the places on the land cover map around Cambodia that give the most freshwater availability, do the best to regulate flow, do the most to help infiltration into the aquifer? All of these important aspects of that the ecosystem, these important services that the ecosystem provides to the people living there. So they can see this, these spatial layers that we derived from the hydrological modeling, from the land cover mapping, and get a sense of where in the country, or even down to the pixel level, a lot of these ecosystem services are most important, and then make decisions about how and where they develop the land. Say, if I'm a member of the Cambodia government, saying, where am I going to allow economic land concessions? They can look at these layers on the tool and say, maybe here would cause further, more degradation of the ecosystem services than this location, and play around with that and use it as part of their land use planning process. So we focus a lot on water because that's obviously a huge deal in Cambodia. The whole dynamic there of the change in direction of flow between the Tonle Sap lake and the Mekong River, depending on the time of year. So when there's more water in the main stem of the Mekong, it actually flows backwards up into the lake, and then part of the year in the drier season, the Tonle Sap flows into the Mekong. So obviously a huge deal. Such an important industry around fishing, rice paddy farms all along the banks of the river and the Tonle Sap Lake are very prone to flooding. They're prone to changes in the sedimentation. So we definitely focus on water. We look at soil. We look at nutrient flow. We also get into carbon emissions, given the importance of forests in Cambodia and the rate at which they're declining. And then, as I was saying, we get into climate change, and really harnessing some of these spatial layers, such as MODIS hotspots, some of the downscaled climate models, to create these spatial layers and combine them to say, how are some of these threats that climate change could worsen really going to affect Cambodia across the spectrum of the country. So some of the things that we are hoping that West Tool will do is, looking at, because this influx of data keeps getting better and better temporal resolution, better spatial resolution, we really try to link some of the farm scale analyses where, if you're working at a 30 meter by 30 meter pixel, you can zoom in quite far, but also related to the wider landscape where you are including it within its larger watershed, you're including it within its larger ecozone. Try to make those two links, those two scales link. We're also trying to bring in the online interactive portion, as Kevin was talking about, making or delivering information in real time rather than waiting for reports to be written, looking at some of the future impacts, and then different types of outputs for different types of uses in terms of looking online, but also being able to create reports if necessary, so people can utilize the tool and then show their outputs wherever necessary. So that's one of three. Now we're going to go into Malawi.
Got my own mic. Thanks, Gabe. And just want to, maybe one last thing I would say about the Cambodia case study is that in the design of this tool that Gabe just discussed, we made a lot of decisions to produce a tool that was broad in its application rather than being having the best hydrologic model or the best land cover change model or the best climate adaptation model. But we really focused on letting users see what was the interplay between how deforestation potentially interacts with watersheds, how adaptation interacts with food availability. And government of Cambodia is fairly opaque about data, so oftentimes different ministries just don't even know what's going on in the country outside of their sort of narrow their narrow charge. So just allowing people to see what was going on in the country and macro scale, the pros and cons of different land use decisions was really eye-opening for a lot of our stakeholders in Cambodia. All right, I'll give a quick discussion about some work we're doing in Malawi. In Malawi, Windrock International has been working with the Environmental Affairs Department and the Forestry Department for the past 3 or 4 years to help them improve their ability to track greenhouse gas emissions. And among other things, part of that includes improved ability to monitor and measure their forest cover and land cover change. So we've been involved with Malawi for the past several years. And just to kind of present the challenge that we face there, Malawi has a lot of self-expressed needs about where it sees itself going in terms of policies on the land. They have extremely ambitiously proclaimed, they're planning to reforest 4.5 million hectares of forest by 2030. That's like more than half the country. You have to appreciate that. A little less ambitious, but still fairly impressive. Their NDC to the Paris Agreement was a 2% forest cover increase by 2020. And if in looking at their nationally appropriate mitigation actions, there's also significant mention of afforestation as an activity. So there's a lot of expressed interest in increasing forest cover in Malawi, but they don't really have any sort of capacity to monitor.
Are those two goals not really consistent with each other? A 2% increase by 2020 and a half the country reforested by 2030. They're very different.
Those are the expressed goals. So that can again just get to the challenge of how sometimes there's not always the best coordination amongst different organs of government. But in any case, I guess I'm just showing, it all points to the fact that they're really trying to be serious about afforestation as a national policy, whatever the number or target ends up being. And so again, it's just the issues we've touched on before. There's probably 10 GIS professionals in the country that would have the capability of helping to design and implement a national forest monitoring system. And again, they're stretched across multiple national priorities. And a lot of the research that has been done in the past has been done by one-off donor-funded kind of initiatives. And just as the prime example, there are 4 completely independent land cover change time series maps that have been created for Malawi covering roughly the same time period. Don't quote me on this exactly, but it's roughly 2000 to 2015, where you have 4 different land cover maps, 4 different land cover change sets of statistics. They're all fairly different from one another. So they're funded by JICA, FAO, RCMRD, which is USAID, and then World Bank. So this is kind of the challenge in moving towards a system that's more, a little bit more sustainable and isn't so dependent on these one-off studies. There's just a lot of technical challenges with land cover change monitoring in Malawi. I don't know if anyone's been to Eastern Africa, but it's a scrubby, dry kind of forest. I don't know if you've heard the term miombo forest, but it really behaves quite differently from the moist tropical forests that a lot of the land cover change products have been more calibrated to. So there's a pronounced difference between dry and wet season. There's a lot of shifting cultivation that isn't really clear where the boundary is between undisturbed forest and shifting cultivation. And there's a lot of small-scale afforestation, reforestation that's led by a whole number of actors in country that may be as small as 1/10 of a hectare per parcel. So there's a lot of flux to the land cover that's happening on a small scale. That would be a pretty decent challenge for somebody who was extremely skilled in this particular problem set. Not to say anything about a local remote sensing office that has stretched resources and personnel. And we're admittedly, I don't have a real final polished product to demonstrate to you yet about the fruits of some of this work, because it's actually quite, some of the talks around the National forest monitoring system are still fairly early in country. But given our experience in the past few years engaging with these actors, we're sort of converging towards a system where we're making a few key recommendations to the country. One, doing as much of it as possible on kind of an online web-based platform, using existing data products that are available, especially ones that have there's an expectation that they're going to be produced at a particular frequency going forward. And I don't mean to harp on a web-based system because the internet is cool, but there is a real advantage to having all of the analysis, all of the models being stored in a place that is accessible and transparent both equally to in-country actors, to the analysts who are doing the work, but then also when new development partners come into the country, there's already kind of a place to go that's accessible worldwide where this analysis is being done, and it can be reviewed, it can be updated, sort of moving away from what we have now, which is data stored on people's hard drives and their computer crashes and then it gets lost, and really, really kind of basic challenges. So I guess, yeah, I mean, this is probably the extreme case, Malawi, in terms of having very restricted access to resources. And I think the primary focus for sustainability needs to be making it transparent and allowing in-country actors to be the ones driving, doing the analysis, but making it so easy that it doesn't fall through the cracks when there's staff turnover or when some government initiative changes course a little bit. So that's why I guess looking towards A, like the web-based platform, and B, that's being the methods that are built into it are specifically referencing kind of these global curated remote sensing products which are coming out on a regular basis. So even though that might not be the paramount of creating the absolute best, most accurate, remote sensing monitoring program for the country, it's at least less dependent on any failure in any one actor, either in country or for a development partner.
All right, so last 3 of 3, last case study here. We'll just touch on some of our work in Ghana, and the interesting part about this case study is that as Kevin was saying, we move towards putting things on the internet and making these more transparent and quickly updatable tools. We came into Ghana. We started this project last year, so we've been going for about a year and a half. And we came in and we said, well, we've got these great ideas. We make a web-based tool. It'll be totally transparent, wonderful. And the folks there basically said that's not going to work here. There's no internet, never mind power in some of these communities, and there might be 1 or 2 computers stashed somewhere, but they're broken and nobody knows how to use them. So can you do something different here? So this project was much more focused on the rural level and land use planning at the community level rather than a national or regional government. And northern Ghana is a very has very distinct seasons in terms of its wet and dry season. So you have times where there's too much water, and then you have times where there's much too little. So they face lots of ecosystem service issues in terms of land being degraded. Areas that were formerly left alone are now being farmed. Areas that were used to be farmed only once every 10 years are now farmed every year or two. And so how do we bridge the gap, and go even a step further from, a group of well-educated urban folks that work for the national government now to community leaders in rural areas, and bring them some of these data that are also important at that level. They also need to understand how their climate is changing. Spatial data is important at any level. So how do we bridge that gap even further? And this is kind of our thought process so far, where we do still use these remote sensing products. We take the derived GIS layers and we put them through hydrological modeling. We put them through carbon analysis, and we say, when we look at the ecosystem services that are most important in this area, what types of land uses that are common here are affecting these ecosystem services, which ones are providing more ecosystem services, and try to synthesize that scientific analysis of the spatial area into non-web-based tools, especially quite generalized decision support tools, where it might just be laminated cards or some sort of physical product that describes a common land use transition and says, well, this is the impact you're going to see. This is what this transition causes in terms of ecosystem services. When you go from a natural forest to a field of corn, these are the different impacts. It might just even be we don't say, oh, you will lose 75 tons of sediment per year. We'll instead say, we'll group those changes into large negative or large positive. And not to say that you shouldn't do that transition, but just so when people do, and they're thinking about how to use their land, they have some sort of basis to say, oh, these are the impacts that it will cause. We're also thinking of designing games that will interactively show some of these impacts and get people thinking about how certain transitions might benefit you economically, but might hurt you in terms of your ecosystem services, or the reverse. So we are still working there. We found that spatial data is still useful even at this scale, even at the community scale. There are some even further challenges when you're working down at rural community scale than you might if you are working at a national government. And landscape level approaches are very important in the sense that you need data about all different aspects of the landscape rather than just focusing in on water or water quality. You need to really look at land use and economics and the whole spectrum to be able to tackle some of these issues. Okay, so we'll briefly touch on a couple of our more developed tools that we have created more on the global scale rather than, so we'll zoom way out now and take a look at some of our online tools.
It would be remiss if we didn't touch on these at least. The two products that I'd like to touch on. First is the Red Plus decision support tool, which is used for countries can use it to help prioritize components of their what's included in the scope of their national RED program. And then secondly, with the AFALU carbon calculator, which is a tool that all USAID projects are mandated to use to report on their greenhouse gas indicators. What is the effect of various interventions on their projects? So it's more at the project scale, but internationally, globally applicable. So the USAID Carbon Calculator allows you to ask a hypothetical. What would happen if I had a improved livestock management project? What if I had a forest protection project of a certain magnitude? I'm going to protect this many hectares. I'm going to have an agroforestry project of this many hectares with this species, but I'm going to do it in this province in the world. Okay, a lot of what goes into the estimation of what the effect of that is there are localized coefficients. There's the background rate of deforestation, there's soil conditions, there's growing conditions. So we built a calculator which essentially integrates all of those global data layers into a database that internationally accepted equations used to estimate the baseline and project emissions for a greenhouse gas reduction project applied onto the top of that, and then gives the user an experience where they are able to either by selecting a area of interest freehand or by selecting a province in the world and then putting in some basic information about their project, come out with a pretty good, I would say, better than an order of magnitude estimate of what would be the effect of this here. So it allows for very rapid, prioritization of projects. So again, this is giving more of the theme of a way that these spatial products have been integrated into a system where the user doesn't necessarily know that any of that is happening in the back, but it does allow for them to make fairly informed decisions about what they're doing on their land at a fairly localized scale.
Okay, and the other tool is quite similar in that it focuses on greenhouse gas emissions, but as RED Plus moved from the project level to the national level, we found that countries and governments were really struggling with some of these decisions that they had to make in terms of designing their RED program. So this tool was designed for the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility out of the World Bank, which is one of the largest RED Plus, which stands for reducing emissions from deforestation, degradation, other activities. The Forest Carbon Partnership Facility is one of the largest funders of these for performance RED Plus schemes. So when countries are designing their programs, they have these series of difficult decisions to make in terms of things that seem very basic, but I'm sure many remote sensing experts understand in terms of what is a forest? How do you define it? What will it mean if you define it in different ways? How will that affect your forest loss over the past 15 years? What do you want to use as your reference period, your baseline? What period of time? Do you want to use 2000 to 2015 or 2000 to 2010? How does that decision affect your results? What activities do you include? Should I include degradation? Should I include carbon stock enhancement? How will that affect my program? How will it make it more difficult or less difficult or change my results? So this tool tries to help countries and walk them through some of those decisions and show them what the impact might be. If I use a 10% canopy threshold instead of a 30%, how does that change the amount of forest I have in my area? If I include 2001 as my base year instead of 2005, how does that impact my program? So it shows a variety. It's always using spatial data to make those estimates. We use a lot of the forest loss data that's come out, carbon stock maps, to make those first order estimates about how things change when you change different definitions, how important certain activities are in terms of how much they emit compared to others within a country. So that more or less is the decision support tool. So now we will wrap this up.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Gabe. All right, I've talked about the challenges enough. The point is that we need to have a way to connect the technical knowledge that is kind of embodied by a group like NASA with the local knowledge held within these communities and these governments. From Winrock's experience, what's really lacking or missing in this relationship can be improved by having more stable relationships between the data producers and the users, and where within that relationship there's an understanding of the very specific context and needs of a particular country. And there's a real role for the international development and NGO community to kind of be that glue, because we're on the ground all the time in these countries. We see which initiatives work, which flop. We see the landscape. So we have kind of a unique perspective, and we want to be there to help in any way that we can to make that translation. And then just moving in towards what kind of products are we hoping to move towards as a community. I think and there's already been so much advances on this. So I don't mean to suggest that this isn't happening, but continuing to move towards curated products and data sets where the data set that you're downloading, it's already kind of a safe space, if you will. There's a certain amount of rigor and peer review that's been done on it in a particular application. And yeah, I think finally is, in our experience, is if you put data into a attractive package and you bring that to countries and it's relevant for a real need that they have, in a lot of cases they'll be excited to use it, and you don't have to worry so much about the bureaucratic side of mandating that policies be changed. If you build a good product, they will kind of come and use it. So that's been our philosophy so far. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. I hope we've left a little bit of time for questions.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Gabriel. We have like 7 minutes for questions, and then we can continue the discussion here if someone wants to stay. I'm gonna ask you a question that was on the online in the chat from Christian Branion when you were talking about, I think it was the West tool in Cambodia. Is the tool made entirely with QGIS? And if not, which additional tools were utilized? You mentioned SWOT.
Well, there's so the underlying data layers were created with through just Esri ArcGIS products with some SWOT add-ons. But there's a second dimension of it, of what's the actual, what system is it implemented in, and what's nice about the other side of some of the advances in technology is with some of the open source and some of the proprietary Esri products, of how easy it is for non-computer programmers to rapidly develop an interactive web map with fairly sophisticated geoprocessing on the backside. So we did that initially through an Esri ArcGIS enterprise server, but then that was translated into a more open source version by people more knowledgeable about that side of it than us. Sorry, Gabe, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, that was right on. The SWOT modeling that we used was as a ArcGIS plugin that allows it to be run across a large watershed, and allows you to put in spatial data to help parameterize the model.
No.
So that was done in ArcGIS.
I guess for the,
Oh,
for
sorry,
the,
go ahead.
oh,
Okay.
I was just wondering for the Ghana case, you had mentioned that there was a lot of high local knowledge of weather and ecosystems. Is there an attempt to actually bring that knowledge in with what they're doing?
Yeah.
Okay, fill that.
So we try to really engage the stakeholders from the beginning in terms of we did kind of a literature review at first in terms of what data exists, what knowledge is there in the academic sphere about ecosystem services, and then we brought together a large range of stakeholders to say, this is what we found. What can you add to it? And also, like, what are the most important ecosystem services to you and your communities and your region? So that really helped focus our study. And having them tell us, this is what we're seeing, these are the changes we're seeing, this is how it's affecting us, this is what's most important to us. So that was kind of our attempt at bringing them in. And also we want to, when we, further develop some of the final tools, really run it by them and say, is this helpful? Can you change it at all? What do you think? Are you going to just take this and say thanks and then throw it in the trash later, or what? So that was how we tried to involve some local.
Yeah, so I have two questions. The first is I'm trying to think about how to better integrate the remote sensing data into the work that you're doing, as you mentioned a lot. So at what level do you think that can successfully be done? Is it at the level of, are you looking for raw remote sensing data from a NASA perspective, in terms of partnerships and collaboration? Are you looking for products, products based on, you come to, let's say, NASA with a need, and that's country specific, and you're looking for not the raw data, or even, on any kind of, our reports on, or whatever we can produce on how to get from raw data to whatever question you're trying to answer, or the countries you're working in are trying to answer. So yeah, the question is more if you can give us a little bit insight in terms of how we can work with you on these kinds of things and at what level. And then the second question is a little bit broader perspective. So a lot of the funding for your work is coming from USAID and maybe World Bank and others. So they're kind of in a way and this is related to the one-off projects versus long-term, having a usable solution over time versus having the one-off projects. So the challenge with that is that you may have the intention of wanting to have something long-term, but then you face the challenge of the one-off projects regardless, right?
Absolutely.
Even with the Forest Service international programs, which I think you've partnered with a lot, it's the same thing, right? When you're working under. So the bigger question is how do you think that we can do a better job as a community, whether scientific, technical, or international development, to integrate these disparate projects and these efforts together so that we have these, technical tools that are not just tools that are out there and then, really cool maps, which they are cool maps, but actually are being used over time and then being worked into the capacity building where you have 10 people that are able to do this today, but by 2030 maybe you have 100 people that can do the analysis. So they're both kind of big questions.
Yeah. I'll make an attempt, and then Kevin can as well, probably wants to as well. So I think with the first question, even us, as people who understand remote sensing and we can look at, show some of those slides that Kevin had about the different satellites and what they're used for. I think we find it most useful when we have products that are not the raw images from the remote sensing, but are interpreted, especially with some of the new satellites like some of the radar data that can be extremely complex, even more so than some of the optical ones. And even the optical ones, we see countries that try to do what perhaps the remote sensing community might see as a basic task, as making a land cover a series of land cover maps that just look at forest versus non-forest and the change, and they struggle with that, and there's a lot of error, and so I think the derived products are really more useful in that sense. That doesn't mean you can't create capacity, and there aren't people out there that know how to quickly to create their own derived products. But yeah, I think what we end up using more are some of the more derived products.
Yeah, and if I could just build on that, I think a lot of countries, the problem is no longer that there isn't enough data out there. So I don't think my top of my response would be some new sensor needs to be put up. But it's that moving towards more missions or initiatives where there's kind of a priority placed on long-term time series consistency, even if that metric, whatever it is, may be crude or it has been improved on since. And the example I'm thinking of, I think it's curated by NASA, but it's the project that links the nighttime brightness index to population and economic indicators, and this has been going on since like the 1980s or something. So even though there are new, more fancier metrics that exist, like this timeline still exists kind of in the original unit. So that's really important for countries to have the confidence to know that if they build a system around a data product, it's going to be there for them 10, 20 years down the line. And then secondly, I don't know where this fits in with NASA's mission, but doing more outreach, even if it's in terms of just creating examples of how to apply a certain product to a very common problem that's in a certain biome or economic system, and in a very even simplistic brochure outreach kind of ways, like, hey, this is the satellite today, and this is the question that it answers, and I think just having those out there would help a lot of countries kind of make the link to, okay, no, this is what we need to move towards.
Yeah,
so,
I think
Can I ask
also.
a follow-up on that?
Yeah.
So do you think that does not exist today? Like from your research and your understanding and the countries that you've worked with?
The kind of brochure sort of.
Yeah, I'm just trying to.
No, if it does, I mean, if it does, if it's like already out there, then like we're also here to like learn from you as well. But from my experience, I have not seen any those resources being accessed by the countries that we work with. So if we're the weak link in that chain, then
Yeah, and things just as basic as like comparing different satellites and what they do. And I often get asked, can you create a table with the different satellites you mentioned and give us the spatial resolution, the temporal resolution, the pros and the cons? And I have not seen that type of comparison or pros and cons of certain satellites
as applied to a particular problem.
As applied to some of the common ways it's used. So things like that would definitely be of use.
Okay, and you already did a second part, but we can circle around afterwards.
I enjoyed the presentation. A quick question, you mentioned, of course, USAID, climate change, carbon budgets, and sustainable relationships many times. Mm-hmm. What is the impact of our present administration on those programs, which deal with those themes?
Yeah, that's. If I knew the question to that, I'd probably.
Are you seeing an impact already or not?
Probably going to have to be a little careful in trying to answer that. I think we're probably just as much in the dark as anyone, but of course we are looking towards at least the next number of years where As a community, we're trying to, and I should say, there's good aspects of this. We're trying to kind of broaden our mindset out of being strictly carbon to being more all-encompassing, looking at cross-ecosystem services. So we're adapting as a group by pushing as much as we were pushing in that direction, even stronger now. And yeah, because I think that there will always be, even if not maybe at the tip top of the pinnacle, within the, within the community, an interest in sustainable natural resource management worldwide, however you define that. So I think if we just are constantly redefining ourselves within that space, then it's the best I can do. Sorry.
So we're going to leave it there for the people online, and then we can continue the discussion here. It was a great presentation. There is, I think, more questions, and we can follow up on that. And we are going to have the recording of the talk on the website, hopefully. And then in December, now the next month, we have an exciting topic for the carbon community. It's going to be about developing greenhouse gas inventories at the city level. That is where many of the action is happening right now. So we're going to have Brendan Shane, who's the North American coordinator for C40 Cities organization. So we'll send more information about that. So thank you again, Kevin.
Thank you.
We'll see you next month. Thank you.